We've talked a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, but we have had a significant blind spot, and that is with accessibility. So today, we're going to add the A to the end of DEI. So stay tuned. Hey everybody, this is Chris Brandt here with Sandesh Patel. Welcome to another future video podcast. Before we get started, I wanted to ask everyone to think about subscribing to the channel. 96% of the people who watch our videos do not subscribe to this channel, and that subscription actually helps us a ton. So would greatly appreciate it if you just took a moment to subscribe. Recently, I attended a conference about the Metaverse called Gatherverse, and it was not what I expected. Rather than conversations filled with technical jargon and speeds and feeds, it was about the human side, the need for inclusivity as we create these new worlds. And I was fortunate enough to attend a session by Taryn Williams, Assistant Secretary at the Office of Disability Employment Policy, who put me in touch with the wonderful people at PEAT, the Department of Labor's Partnership on Employment and Accessibility Technology. So today we're going to be talking with PEAT co-directors Corinne Weibel and Bill Curtis Davidson about what the accessibility landscape looks like and how all of us can do a better job advocating for people with disabilities in the workforce. Welcome, Corinne and Bill.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. I think this is, like I mentioned, I think this is a topic that we've really failed to talk about, and it's so important. When we've talked a lot about DEI, but the accessibility piece, I think we haven't had enough of a conversation about. So I'm really excited about this, and I really appreciate you guys coming on. But before we get into all that, could you just give me a little bit about how PEAT got started and what the mission behind PEAT was?
We are funded by the U.S. Department of Labor, and our mission is to foster collaborations with technology stakeholders and leaders to make sure that new and emerging technology is accessible from the start. And by accessible, we mean technology that is built in a flexible way for the widest user base possible, so that everyone can use it. Because people use different technology in different ways, depending on whether they can manipulate a mouse, how much vision they have, how many colors they see, how much they hear, and how they process information. Well, this is essential because technology has become an essential part of every workplace. Today, even jobs that don't involve technology to do a job probably still involve technology to apply to a job or as part of the interview process, especially in the last few years. And we're already coming into this situation with a significant employment gap for people with disabilities. So if we can ensure that new and emerging technologies are accessible by design, technology can become an equalizer instead of a barrier.
Yeah, I got to mention it's tough because obviously the range of disabilities is enormous, and the sort of remedies for all these individuals is unlimited, and I think it's got to be a really important time to push these initiatives because one, we've got a lot of activity happening on that front, but we've also got this worker shortage. And there's been a lot of people who have been sidelined historically that could be participating, if we just do a better job, right? So I think what you guys are doing is really really important work. But for the people who are looking to hire people with disabilities and bring people into their company, what are the most kind of common misconceptions that people would have about hiring people with disabilities?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think a lot of people aren't aware that they already most certainly have workers or colleagues with disabilities, even if those people haven't disclosed. Over half of disabilities are invisible. There's research out there that up to 30% of white-collar workers have a disability. And so they're there for sure. 1 in 4 people in the United States has a disability. But people with disabilities are often afraid to disclose it at work. It's something they hide because they are worried about discrimination. They're worried about judgment. And that means that they're not getting the support they need to do the best job they can do. So that, is a problem for everyone, both employers and employees.
That's shocking to me that, the numbers you're talking about are actually quite staggering. And it's amazing how many people must be struggling.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is that, people don't realize that the majority of job accommodations cost very little. They're usually involving pretty minor changes to someone's schedule or work environments. The latest numbers I've seen, that in 2021, employers reported that 56% of accommodations cost zero.
Hmm.
And for the accommodations they did have come up, most were a one-time cost, and the median cost was only $500, which is very, very little when you think about the investment people have made in their people.
I've worked with folks with disabilities in the past, and I was, they needed oftentimes very little accommodation to really be very productive in the workforce, but they did need some. I mean, it wasn't always an easy path.
Absolutely, and I just also want to point out that a wonderful thing about accessible design is that it helps everyone.
Yeah.
The classic example of this is the curb cut. These were installed into sidewalks after 1990 when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. And they were installed with wheelchair users in mind, but once it was there, they turned out to be very popular with anyone who might be pushing a stroller or delivering something where they were wheeling a cart. And that's the classic story, and it's totally true with technology too. For example, captions in virtual meetings are essential for someone who's deaf. But it also turns out they are very useful if somebody is like a person who speaks English as a second language, or even someone who's in a shared open workspace who needs to keep the sound on mute. And they have also been shown to boost user engagement for everybody. So once an accessible design is there, everybody tends to benefit.
Yeah, I use closed captions all the time because I oftentimes watch things at double speed and things like that, and having those closed captions, my ability to retain and absorb the information just is much higher. So like people learning languages. I mean, that's another great use case for closed captions. That's an interesting point that so much of this really does apply to the population at large too. So that's it. What types of technologies are you guys typically focusing on at PEAT?
So this is Bill. So as you heard earlier, PEAT recognizes the world of work is changing, right? Increasing number of employees are working remotely, as we all know, and have experienced. And we rely on multiple technologies to stay connected to employers, clients, and collaborators. And with that, workplace technology is also changing. Everyone's doing online meetings, and whether you know it or not, artificial intelligence and other technologies are really pervasive in a lot of tools and systems that we already use. And then newer technologies like virtual and augmented reality are quickly rising, especially as we recover from the pandemic. And while PEAT has always had a focus on digital accessibility, and that means just, the accessibility of devices, platforms, and documents. In recent years, we really pivoted to focusing more on emerging technologies like artificial intelligence or AI, extended reality, sometimes we call XR, and automated vehicles or AV.
I think this pandemic, while it's been, obviously terrible, there's been a little bit of a silver lining to it in the sense that it's brought to the forefront, and more so than brought to the forefront, but made acceptable the use of a lot of these technologies and these working accommodations. And some people actually really thrived in these environments kind of unexpectedly. So it seems like it's kind of a boom time for all of this. and so, like with all of COVID, changes that have happened. I mean, can you speak to, what these changes mean, not just for right now, because I mean, certainly people with, disabilities sometimes have to worry about, compromised immune systems and things like that. And so there's so that negative side to all of this and accommodations for that. But on the other hand, it's brought in all this other stuff. Could you kind of talk to how that's changed the landscape a bit?
When we think about the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, it really forced organizations to switch to telework without much preparation. Yeah. And this shift came more naturally than some employers expected it to. In fact, a McKinsey global survey indicated that in the case of remote working, respondents actually say their companies moved 40 times more quickly than they thought possible before the pandemic. So this meant that a lot of workers were shifting to remote work and required at-home setups and more support for digital meetings. And many people suddenly had to learn how to make them accessible to all so that everyone could be included. So this was a kind of great realization, if you will, that workplace accommodations that people with disabilities had been asking for years, like telework, became really possible very quickly, right? Yeah. And so after taking time to build their telework infrastructures, many employers now see the value of keeping remote work to achieve their missions and enhance their employee engagement. And again, we're seeing much research on this. It's very specific, like employers reporting that they're going to offer more remote work options, right, in the hybrid phase of their evolution. And as the pandemic subsides. And as employers evaluate how they're going to operate, many are considering hybrid work models and how do they best accommodate employees with disabilities who will benefit from flexible work situations, depending on their health, location, and other needs.
We've certainly seen how quickly businesses pivoted and rushed to that. And I got to imagine for, people have been advocating for some of these changes for many, many years and getting brushed aside and, saying, oh, we can't afford to do that, or it's too much work, or the technology's not there. That must have been both frustrating and very, satisfying at the same time, right? Because it proved out their case, right?
Right. I think what all of us that work in accessibility understand is we recognize exclusion more readily than many do. And that's actually one of the first steps in inclusive design, is to recognize people are being excluded.
You made the mention of AI was there in terms of like using artificial intelligence like for hiring. Mm-hmm. But one of the challenges around AI is the lack of diversity in both the data sets and in the people who are building the tools, right? And so, do you feel that obviously AI can help to take some of the discrimination out of hiring, by kind of giving a look at different kind of look at resumes, but on the other hand, it also has some implicit biases that may work against some people. I mean, are you seeing things like that as well?
This is such a complex issue that we have a whole toolkit about it that we released last fall. In short, yes, it's something employers should be thinking a lot about, because there are serious concerns that these technologies have a tendency to screen out people with disabilities. Disabilities are incredibly diverse, and it's just a very hard thing because people with disabilities have often been underrepresented in the workforce. Yeah. So corresponding data that employers are often using as a metric against what kind of employees they want, they may not be there in the data set. Our toolkit offers some great resources, in particular our AI playbook, which goes through centralized policies and best practices that employers can take to really think about these issues and implement a way to integrate AI that reduces bias.
Yeah, and I'll add links to all these the playbooks that you're referencing in the show notes as well. So I kind of interrupted the thoughts around COVID, and I think we were talking about how COVID has changed things, but COVID actually has another side to it that we're looking at it that it is going to potentially be a mass disabling event too, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I've seen numbers. I think that well over half of Americans at this point have had COVID. And while some people recover fully, others experience lingering symptoms. Brain fog, for example, is very common and can affect somebody's ability to focus and their short-term memory. So things like inclusive design have become even more important when you think about this aspect, because inclusive design really helps by making things easy and intuitive to navigate. And another, kind of adjacent challenge over the last few years is mental health wellness.
Yeah.
Employees are having to really confront this challenge, and employers have to be able to address it in remote and hybrid environments, which is again a challenge. So just one example, we're all dealing with video conference fatigue. Employers are having to come up with policies to think about how they can help and address it. So, allowing cameras being optional at least some of the time is something that can really help. And that's also a great example of something that the disability community often recommends. And in general, we can learn a lot from them about following recommendations there to design for everyone.
I came across you guys, when I was at this Metaverse event, like I mentioned, and there's obviously, virtual worlds and, augmented reality, extended reality, all that sort of, those sort of technologies, virtual reality, I can imagine they play a tremendous benefit. They have tremendous benefit to folks with disabilities in many regards. Could you talk a little bit about how the rise of the metaverse and these XR technologies will really help us tap into some workers that might have been marginalized in the past?
In today's workplaces, we're definitely seeing, especially in the hybrid work evolution that we're all going through, extended reality or XR tools are being used to help people virtually work alongside their colleagues who are in the office or remote locations around the world, right, to allow for more seamless collaboration. And they're also using XR to engage employees, especially in the dominant use case of training, right, which is really a big use case in XR, probably the dominant one, alongside collaboration, communication. And so you see really large examples of this where XR and immersive technologies are being used to help people get those high growth jobs, right? Training for clean energy or manufacturing or healthcare, for example, are some of the industries that we talk about actually in a white paper that PEAT published. But as with any new technology you bring into the workplace, organizations need to think about how to implement these with equity and inclusion in mind.
Right.
And when you adopt XR technologies, you'll notice there is a direct relationship between how accessible they are and how productive everyone is, right? How effective it is in bringing everyone together. If that's the whole point of using the technology, you're not going to have an effective program if you don't think about accessibility. So, and then there is an aspect of immersive technologies when they are made accessible that they can benefit people, obviously employees who have sensory, physical, or cognitive disabilities, or people who are neurodivergent. They also can improve usability when used in different environments and use cases. So think about, for example, captioning was mentioned earlier. When captioned speech is available in an immersive meeting tool, it's obviously useful for employees, really critical for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but also cases where there's a loud environment, such as a factory setting, which is very common, using XR to help on an assembly floor, right? Or something like assembling a complex product. You might actually have to have captions, not only for speech, like for remote assist, from other humans or from media that's playing, like to a training video that someone's looking at in situ. This is really important in terms of future-proofing the technology as well, because unfortunately, as humans, we will all acquire limitations as we age. And so it really is one of this sort of trifecta of, yes, we're thinking about disability inclusion, but we also need to think about our future selves and also use cases where people are limited in sensing or physical movement, things like that.
I fall into that category as I'm getting older, my hearing isn't what it used to be, too many years of rock and roll and that. And, I do
Same.
struggle in, I struggle in, loud restaurants and things like that. So, for my personal interests, there's benefit to that. But I think, you mentioned, and again, we're coming back to the idea of having people included in the development of these tools and systems as well, because I think people with disabilities bring a perspective to the development of these tools that's really necessary. And as you mentioned before, can have follow-on benefits to the larger population without disabilities as well, right? So I think it's really important to include those people, right?
If you ask me what the top 3 to-dos are in immersive tech, we say it's always make it a point to think about how the technology is going to be used or implemented and by people with different sensory, physical, and cognitive needs. And again, those temporary or situational restrictions. If you're implementing a system for a factory floor, you really will already be thinking about sound and noise, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But it is important not to make assumptions about what's valuable and instead leverage people who have direct lived experience, not only of a disability, which really is about exclusion, how they work around that, like what is useful for them. And so you can do that by consulting with disability inclusion and accessibility experts or advocates, either inside your organization or in your school, community, or advocacy groups in your local community are a great source that we see people partnering with. And it will help you learn their perspective and help define requirements, whether you're building something or buying it and implementing it.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point about, disability being kind of thought of as, kind of an exclusion thing. But in some regards, there are, I was listening to another podcast and it was on disability. And they were talking about that, sometimes people with disabilities are actually ideally suited to certain types of jobs, but aren't considered for them. And this was in the context of space missions, and people with disabilities have been sort of precluded from going to space. But they mentioned it was really an interesting concept that there was a fire on one of the space stations. I believe it was Mir, and it lasted for 14 minutes, but they said, the cabin filled with smoke, and they all had to put on respirators, to manage that. And the person who was talking said, people who are blind are accustomed to working in environments without sight, and somebody who is, has that capability could more rapidly sort of resolve that situation. So, it's not always straightforward, as to what are the capabilities or what are the needs from the business and what people can provide, right?
We're involved in different various community efforts, such as one on immersive captions, for example, which we've talked quite a bit about. We've mentioned captions today. And this is reportedly one of the best meetings that we all attend. And the reason for that is because there are so many ideas shared by people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or people even with cognitive challenges who use captions in different ways. And then when we think about all of the angles, some people prefer captions. Some people want to have a transcript running to the side, or different aspects of the same kind of challenge area.
Yeah.
And it's really just sort of made a very robust design discussion or implementation discussion when you do have that talent on your team. So that's an example of, and in this case, we're trying to eventually write standards for what are immersive captions supposed to be like, right? How do you look at them? How do you activate them? What happens if you get further away from something or you need to zoom in on it, right, in a 3D space? These are angles that you really need the talent and the experience of people with disabilities to sort of unpack all of that and build it with really a lot of robust capability.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about that, it's important to have people with varying levels of disability and different types of disability, I would imagine, as well, because what works for one individual may be the opposite of what somebody else may need. And to be able to find a way to strike that balance, it's you need not only just diversity in the group that's building these things, but diversity within the accessibility piece of that as well.
You don't have to be perfect with all of this and try to accommodate every possible angle. Sometimes people feel like it's overwhelming to think about all of this. And it's important that everyone understand, get started today. Yeah. If you're not doing it already, get started. Get involved with people with disabilities on your team. If you don't have every kind of, physical or sensory disability present, it's at least important to start somewhere and to build as best you can, do the best you can with engaging the community and then try to keep improving over time.
I'm glad you said that because, when I'm listening to this, I'm just saying, oh my, this is so incredibly overwhelming, like how much work there is to do here. But I think, every journey starts with, just a step, right? And hopefully you can make a lot more than just one step, but getting started, I think, is the key here, right?
Right. And there are a number of resources around. I'll mention, part of getting involved in this is really to get involved in the community. So I'll just call out in the XR space, PEAT's been a founding supporter of xraccess.org. This is a community of cross-sector participants from disability advocacy organizations, industry platform technology companies, academia who are dedicated to ensuring that XR is accessible to people with disabilities. And I do want to point out that if you're watching this before June 2022, you can plan to attend a symposium on June 9th and 10th this year, 2022, and it is an annual event. And so that's something that is free. It's all virtual, and you'll get to see what's happening in this community and get started, if you're not already involved.
Yeah, that sounds like a really awesome opportunity, and I think I'm gonna, I'm gonna take advantage of that because I feel like I just have personally a lot to learn around this as well.
What are the most common needs for people with disabilities? Like if there was like the best bang for the buck where, we could make investments in, what are those needs that could have an immediate, solid return?
If we stick to XR, one of the things to keep in mind, and I think you've probably experienced this with other types of devices, is to have flexibility of interaction modes and inputs. I think most people watching this will understand things like smart speakers or using their mobile device and then switching to their laptop. And if you're fully able-bodied, you may use your voice, then use your hands, then use, your vision to look at something. And really XR platforms sort of bring all of that to bear. They have different modes of input like hand tracking or eye gaze targeting, and then different kinds of inputs like motion controllers. And so one of the things that's being worked on in general is how do we have different kinds of input modalities? And the industry has been developing all of those. And what the disability community and, for example, the people working in XR accessibility are looking at is how do we make sure all of that works fluidly and works maybe similarly across platforms, things like that. So that if you can't use a motion controller, maybe you can use voice commands to utilize an app, right? If you can't use voice commands, maybe you use some other method like a attachable adapted keyboard or something like that. So there are different ways to interact. And that's really one, when you're thinking about the technology part of it, adaptable, flexible interaction modes is one big item that you can think of.
I was just trying to figure out, like, what is are there more disability folks that need that have the sensory disability, or is it more the physical disability that causes other requirements? You know what I mean?
This is Corinne. That question is kind of impossible to answer, especially since some people have more than one disability. I think, like disabilities are just so diverse. But the number one thing that anyone can ever do is ask. Asking people what they need is generally gets you your answer on what to provide.
I just think there's what I'm learning here today is that there's just such a knowledge gap, right? Like I'm learning so much right now, things I'd never even thought about, but I should be.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Cool.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point, right? I mean, I think that we all kind of go through our daily lives and have our own problems that we're worried about, and we don't look around us to see what other people may need, and it's not, if it's not part of our direct experience, it's really hard for us to imagine. And I think if I were running, a large enterprise, or not even a large enterprise, small enterprise, or, what are like the most important things that I could do, if I wanted to hire and work with people who have disabilities?
So first of all, I'd say ensure that your recruiting process is accessible and inclusive. We hear so many stories from people who have tried to submit an application and they can't get around that inaccessible chatbot, or they can't figure out what button to press to submit the application because they're not labeled for someone who's using a screen reader. And these are easy problems in a lot of cases to solve. So test your platform for accessibility. And a lot of platforms are accessible out of the box, but it's when they get customized. For example, if somebody might change the colors, to a brand colors, but then the colors don't have sufficient color contrast. So you have to be careful there. And one of the most important things that anyone can do is include a working phone number somewhere that applicants can call if they're having trouble submitting that application. Just making sure they have someone to contact so that they can submit that application in an alternate way.
That's an interesting one too, because so many businesses are trying to, they're constantly trying to use technology to pull costs out of the business. And so they're eliminating staff and people answering phones and things like that. But there's a real downside to that.
It is. And it's also an easy solution. But another consideration I do want to address is artificial intelligence. We talked a bit about that before. But that is something people need to consider, especially because these systems have become ubiquitous. And it's really the bias angle is something you really want to think hard about and work on mitigating. And there are tangible steps that people can take. But overall, as part of that process, one of the things we recommend in the AI playbook, which is broadly applicable, is start a disability ERG if you don't have one. Once you have one, make sure the people that participate, particularly the leadership, that they're compensated for that time. And then really listen to what they come up with and what they recommend. To really succeed at creating accessibility culture, you need to involve people with disabilities themselves in every step. A lot of people tell us they're not attracting candidates organically, but there are great companies out there that do directly connect job seekers with disabilities that have disclosed the disability to employers. So that's a great starting point as well.
You have to make the effort. It may not be a significant effort or not, but you just have to actually make the effort.
And once you do, things snowball.
Yeah.
Like once you get just everybody learning a little bit about accessibility and understanding that it's everybody's job to make sure that the document they're creating is accessible, that's really when, it becomes this self-sustaining thing.
Well, and you mentioned one thing that I want to kind of go back to and highlight is, just ask if people need accommodations and this, but I think also, I think what we're all seeing here, or at least Sandesh and I are seeing here, is that education is really important. And, what we don't know about disability is far larger than what we do know about disability, obviously. Obviously you guys have an enormous amount of resources on the PEAT website, which I'll provide links to. But I mean, what sort of resources for, just getting people educated on these topics, would you recommend?
Sure. We do offer many resources that speak to the topics we covered today. One great place to get started is our Telework and Accessibility Toolkit, which, if you're interested in digital accessibility, making the virtual workplace accessible, goes through a lot of very detailed walkthroughs on topics like how do you plan for and conduct a virtual meeting? Or what kind of language should you have in your vendor contract to ensure that the vendor is going to remediate any accessibility issues in future updates? So we also, our latest toolkit, the Inclusive XR and Hybrid Work Toolkit, is very helpful to organizations that are considering adopting these new tools because, as we've talked about today, remote work and the hybrid workplace is here and is not going anywhere. And these tools are really starting to enter the mainstream. So we have to ensure they're accessible. As mentioned, the AI and Disability Inclusion Toolkits helps organizations learn how to use AI in equitable ways and to reduce bias in the technology it uses. And an important component of this toolkit in particular is that bias, with disability crosses over and intersects with a lot of other kinds of bias. So intersectionality is something that is really embedded throughout this toolkit. Finally, you can access a wealth of stories of collaborators and people advancing accessibility in the workplace by listening to our own podcast, which is called the Future of Work Podcast.
And it's a great podcast, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a great collaboration with an HR blog called Workology.com. And, all of our resources are available at PEATWorks, PEATWORKS.org. And you can also follow us on Twitter at that handle, PEATWorks, and on LinkedIn.
I, appreciate the work you've done and the work you're doing, and I really appreciate you coming on. And I just, from a little bit of a personal story, my wife's grandfather had ALS, and he wrote, I think, 2 books. He helped develop with his eye movement, and with helped develop some of the those early technologies and sort of eye tracking and things like that. But the more important thing, I think, is he was on a respirator and had no mobility. He loved sailing, and literally until the day he died, he was on a hammock on a sailboat, just 25-foot sailboat, just with all his gear, just sailing and having the time of his life. And I think the thing that tells me is that you can't count people with disabilities out, because there's tremendous capability there. And there's, we oftentimes think people can't do things, but, people find a way to do things, and, can be incredibly productive and creative and do amazing things, regardless of the challenges. So, thanks for all you do, and really appreciate you coming on, and this has been wildly educating for us. And thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Check the show notes for all the links to the different resources that we mentioned in the podcast. And if you like what you saw, give us a like and think about subscribing. That subscription is super important, helps the show out a ton. And I will see you in the next video.